you come in. And welcome to our Big Questions evening. I'm Peter Brown. I'm one of the elders here at Lansdowne, here at Woodbury Avenue. And you're all very welcome indeed. And this is an evening where we've had for a good number of months now. Once a month, our Big Questions evening, which is very different format to what we normally have. It's a talk by Micheal Ots on various subjects that can be a real challenge. Tonight's it's Can Miracles Really Happen? And we're obviously, some of us are aware of the miracles that are recorded in the Bible, the turning water into wine, and of course the resurrection of Jesus being the biggest miracle of all. But a number of questions that it's very possible for us to have. Is it possible for a rational person to believe in miracles? If we look at our current day, if they can happen, why don't I ever see them? That's something that many of us probably ask. And if God can do miracles, why doesn't he intervene? Why doesn't he intervene in the various issues that happen in the world in our modern day? So these are some of the questions that Micheal will be speaking on. The format for the evening is, I'm just going to ask Micheal a few questions, just to see where he's been, because if you remember, a month ago was the last time Micheal was here, and we had Andy Mayo playing music and speaking at our last Big Questions. So a lot's gone on for Micheal since then. Micheal will give a talk around Can Miracles Really Happen? And then when Micheal finishes, we'll have a question and answer session that we normally do. Those questions can be written on your sheet. Sheets are located at various chairs around the church. If you'd like to ask a question, please write that down and we'll collect those in. There'll be a number on the screen. It's not there yet, but a number on the screen to text. So if you've got a question as Micheal's speaking, just drop it into the text, send it, and we'll also include those. And if we get an opportunity, we'll have a roving microphone to actually take questions from you people tonight. So a really good opportunity to unblock and get rid of those. If there's anything that you really feel you've got a block with miracles, then we can chat those through tonight. So if Micheal, if you'd like to come on up, and you've had a busy time.
I have.
You've rushed back today from Leeds?
Leeds
on
Friday night.
From Friday night.
Yeah.
And you're off immediately to Warwick, aren't you? After this service. So a lot going on. Tell us a little bit about it in the last month.
Yeah, it's great. Since I was here last, we're in London as a team at University College London, doing a week of events there, and then up to Edinburgh with all the universities in Edinburgh working together for a week up there, and then back for a few days, and then this last week up in University of Leeds. First time ever to Leeds. So
was it?
Can you believe that? So
you've add that to your list.
Yeah. So Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Leeds. It's exotic.
Good. A good week this week.
Yeah, it was a wonderful week. The Christian Union there, it's probably about 50, 60, 70 people. They booked out a marquee. Well, they didn't book it. They hired a marquee right in the centre of the university outside the Students' Union. So no one in the University of Leeds could have missed what was going on with this massive marquee sitting there. Events each lunchtime and each evening, a kind of cafe in the marquee throughout the day. So people just dropping in, chatting over coffee, asking questions. And it was brilliant to see up to 150 people at each event coming, really engaging, asking questions. By the end of the week, about 100 people who said, look, I really want to find out more about this. 24 people who said, I really want to get started following Jesus. I think a real highlight was on Thursday. I'd been chatting to one student after the lunch bar, and she got all sorts of kind of doubts and questions, and we were chatting them through, and nothing seemed to be kind of really clicking. And then Thursday evening, just at the end of the talk, I didn't go to her. She came running up to me, and she just had this massive smile on her face, and she says, I get it! I finally get it! And it had like all the pieces from not just that week, but from kind of investigating these things for months and months, just had fitted together in her mind, and it just had really clicked. So that was a joy seeing that kind of thing happen. Yeah.
And an encouragement for you, because, you can be on that treadmill of going to different places and giving the talks, but to see those encouragements come through, that sort of re-energizes yourself, I'm sure. And God's in control and making a huge difference. I'll leave you to your talk.
Great.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Pete, and welcome. Great to have you here today. And if you're here for the first time, then especially warm welcome to you. As Pete said, there's going to be a number up for most of the talk, so that's one way that you can ask questions. So be texting, make sure your phone is on, silent, but on, and you can text away to that, or if you've not got your phone or you'd want to save your texts, then you can write them, as Pete said, on the pieces of paper that are provided around the church, and we'll collect them in at the end. Thanks to Gav for the music that was playing. He put that mix together. Now, when I said to Gav, we'd like some music and the talks on miracles, I was a little bit worried about what songs he might pick, because there was one by Hot Chocolates that came to mind that we didn't have, thankfully, before the talk. It's funny, isn't it? People say that miracles can't happen. This talk tonight actually could be a lot shorter. I could just say to you, miracles can happen, because Leicester City won the Premier League. And given their current form, it's an even greater miracle, you might say, that they managed to win the Premier League last year. How on earth did that happen? But of course, when we talk about miracles, we're not just talking about events that are statistically unlikely. And according to the bookies, that was statistically more unlikely than Elvis Presley being found alive. Or events that are just wonderful but natural occurrences. This morning I got to meet Monty Reynolds, John and Alex's new baby, just a few days old. And I held the baby in the service this morning, and people would say, well, it's a miracle. And in some ways, of course, yes, he is. But in another sense, there was a very natural process that led to the birth of that child that I don't need to talk about. We're not talking about naturally occurring phenomena like babies or sunsets or unlikely phenomena like Leicester City winning the Premier League. We're talking about things that don't normally happen, that seem to happen outside of the laws of nature, that cannot be just naturally explained. Can those kind of things really happen? I was in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine a few years ago, leading a group of people on a tour around the sites connected with biblical events. And we'd seen all sorts of places where certain biblical events would have taken place. And at the end of the week, we were sitting on the last night by the shore of Galilee, just by the hotel where we were staying. And I was chatting to a lady. Her daughter had come on the trip as well, and we were talking about different things. And she said, well, what's been the highlight for you this week? And I said, well, it's just been wonderful, hasn't it, to see these places where these events took place. We read about, Jesus feeding the 5,000 or walking on water or raising Lazarus from the dead. But to put these places into real historical context, it's wonderful to see where it actually happens. Bearing in mind that we just spent the last 10 days looking at these places and talking about these events, what she said next was quite surprising. She looked at me and she said, sorry, you think they actually happened? And I said, well, yes, that's what we've been saying for the last week. We've been reading all these stories in these different places. She says, but you think they actually happened? And I said, yes. And she says, but how? Because we know that miracles can't happen. I'm a doctor, and I know that dead people stay dead. And she was absolutely amazed. For the last 10 days, she thought, well, of course, they're nice stories, aren't they? But to really think that there was a dead man called Lazarus that could come back to life, or there was a sick person who could be made well, or that 5,000 people were really fed with a young boy's packed lunch. Can you really believe that? And so many people today would just say, well, we put miracles into the world of make-believe and fairy tale. You've got Aladdin and his lamp, you've got Peter Pan, who never gets old, you've got Santa Claus, and then you've got all the stories of the Bible that go with it. And for many, what we then would do is say, well, we might keep the Bible and Christianity, but let's just take all the miraculous or the supernatural out of it. I met someone who said that to me this week. They said, look, I like going to church. I like the idea there might be some kind of God up there. And I like some of the teachings of Jesus, but I can't believe the miracles. I'll just take those out. More famously, Thomas Jefferson was someone who did this. Maybe you've heard of the Jefferson Bible, where he literally, physically cut out all the bits of the Bible that he couldn't believe, namely the miracles of Jesus and the supernatural events that take place. Let's just cut those things out. Now, maybe you say, well, that's okay, isn't it? So, we don't have to believe in miracles to believe in Christianity. We can take those bit out and just keep hold of the moral ideas and the nice teachings that Jesus gives. But actually, the problem we've got is that Christianity doesn't really allow that to take place. When you start to read the pages of the New Testaments, take the miracles out of the stories of Jesus, and it's not like you're taking the trimmings off the edge of a roast dinner. It's like you're taking the roast out of the roast dinner, the central thing. Listen to how one early Christian put it in one of the first New Testament books, a book called 1 Corinthians. Paul writes, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins." So he's saying this grand miracle, the miracle of the resurrection, he says if that didn't happen, then actually everything we're saying is rubbish. And your faith is useless. And actually there's nothing in it at all. He says, look, it really does matter whether the miraculous has happened. It really does matter whether these stories are true, because if they're not, then the whole thing falls down like a pack of cards. There is not really a Christianity that isn't miraculous. When you take the miraculous out of it, you take out the very center, the core, or the foundation. So why is it that people struggle to believe in miracles? Maybe that's you tonight. You struggle to believe that these things could happen. Sometimes we say, well, it's because there isn't enough evidence. But actually, perhaps the issue isn't so much with the evidence, but maybe the issue is with our presupposition, our ideas that we bring to the whole discussion. Let me illustrate. I was in Poland a couple of years ago speaking at a university in Warsaw. And after one of the events, a guy came up to me. We'd met a couple of times. And he said, look, I want to talk about the Bible. So we talked at length about the evidence for the fact that the Gospels could be eyewitness accounts of things that really happened. We talk about the evidence for the resurrection and so on. But the conversation kind of went round in circles. It wasn't getting very far. So eventually, I said to him, look, if I could present you with convincing evidence that the Bible was true and that Jesus rose from the dead, would you believe? And he looked at me and he said, but you can't. I said, sorry, that wasn't my question. I said, if I could show you, in theory at least, evidence that the Bible was true and that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, would you believe? He said, but you can't. I said, no, that wasn't my question, whether I can or not. I said, but if I, in theory, could, would you? And he said, but you can't. And I said to him, that shows that our last hour's conversation has been pretty pointless. He said, has it? I said, yes. I said, because you've actually shown that you've already made up your mind about what can and cannot happen, and looking at the evidence isn't going to change that, is it? If you've already assumed that it just cannot happen. And that's the issue for many people. Not that we've looked at the evidence and we found it unconvincing, but we start with this assumption, well, it just can't happen. And of course, if we start with that assumption, then no matter how much evidence we have, it's not really going to help us. This is how C.S. Lewis put it at the beginning of his book on this subject, simply called Miracles. He said, those who want to assume that miracles cannot happen are merely wasting their time by looking into the texts. We know in advance what results they will find, for they have begun by begging the question. So he says, watch out that we don't make that mistake. Now, why is it that so many people today have this presupposition, this assumption that miracles cannot happen? Well, Richard Dawkins gives us a clue when he says this. He says, the 19th century is the last time when it was possible for an educated person to admit to believing in miracles like the virgin birth without embarrassments. When pressed, many educated Christians are too loyal to deny the virgin birth and the resurrection, but it embarrasses them because their rational minds know that it is absurd, so they would much rather not be asked. So he says, it's the case today that people don't believe this. He says, and actually it's been the case since the 19th century. Now what has happened to make that the case in the Western world today? For if you go to some parts of the world, they have no problem believing in miracles. If you go back a few hundred years, people had no problem believing in miracles. Why today is that the case? Well, firstly, there was an idea that really grew in popularity in the 17th century called deism. Some people talk about the belief in God as theism, theos, meaning God. Deism was an idea that there was a God who might have created the world, but that God never gets involved in the world. He's absent from it. He's like an absent watchmaker who winds up his creation and then leaves it to go. And so in deism, there might be a God, but that God would never be able to do miracles because he doesn't get involved. That was in the 17th century. In the 18th century, there was a philosopher called David Hume that also contributed to this discussion. I don't know if you've heard of David Hume. This is his statue in Edinburgh. I used to cycle past it when I was studying up in Edinburgh, and we were there just the other week. But David Hume, even if you've not heard of him, presented ideas on the subject of miracles that have very much become part of the thinking of most of people in the Western world today. He said this, amongst other things. He said, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience as can be imagined. It is no miracle that a man, seemingly in good health, should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death, though more unusual than any other, has yet frequently been observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must therefore be uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit that description. Now that's a bit complicated, isn't he? He's saying a lot of stuff there. Basically, what is David Hume saying? Let me boil it down into three things that he says. He's saying this. Firstly, our experience tells us that miracles don't happen. And if they had happened, and if they do happen, then of course they wouldn't be miracles. They'd just be things that normally happen. Okay? So he says, because we haven't experienced miracles, because no one has experienced miracles, we know they haven't happened. Secondly, if miracles did happen, they would break the laws of nature. Because laws of nature tell us what should happen, and a miracle is different to what should happen. And so you can't believe in miracles, therefore, as many would suggest, and be a scientist, because they would be in contradiction with each other. And then thirdly, he says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And he says, when you see the kind of claims that the Bible makes, you would need such great evidence to believe it that there could be no such evidence. So that's what he's basically saying. And even if you've not heard of David Hume or even cycled past his statue, those ideas sit in the back of many people's minds. And all I want to do is really ask three questions in response to those three ideas. How might we start? Firstly, does our experience of miracles, exclude the possibility of miracles? There are lots of people today, maybe lots of people here today in this room, who would say, look, I've not experienced or seen a miracle. Miracles haven't happened in my sphere of influence. But actually, by nature, miracles are rare, aren't they? They're not the kind of things that happen all the time. That's one of the ways we would talk about a miracle. And I remember speaking at an event, and I was speaking on the subject of the resurrection of Jesus. And a student said to me afterwards, he says, I can't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. I said, why not? He said, because things like that don't happen every day. I said, well, yeah, exactly. That's the point, right? I mean, if they did happen every day, we wouldn't be talking about the resurrection of Jesus, because it wouldn't be any different. By nature, miracles are things that don't normally happen. Actually, sometimes we get the impression, don't we, that the Bible describes a period of history when miracles always happened, and now we live in a period of history when miracles never happen. But that's not actually true. The Bible is written over a period of 1,500 years. And there were whole swathes of that time when there were no seemingly outwardly spectacular miracles taking place. The miracles of Jesus, the miracles connected with the law and the prophets, were to do with certain specific points in that much larger period of history. So just because I haven't experienced a miracle, or you haven't, doesn't mean that they cannot happen. It's a bit like, if you lived in some parts of Africa saying, snow cannot exist because I haven't seen it. It does, you just live in the wrong place. Or if you live in the west coast of Norway and saying, droughts do not exist because I haven't experienced one. Say, no, you just happen to live in the wettest part of Europe. You can live in the wrong place at the wrong time. Personal experience isn't essential, is it? But actually, David Hume goes a bit beyond that. He says, it's not just that I haven't experienced miracles. He says, no one has. He says, the uniform experience of history is that miracles haven't happened. But what's the problem with that? The only way that you can say that miracles that no one in history has ever experienced miracles, the only way you can say that is if you start by assuming that miracles can't happen. You see, how can David Hume or me or you or anyone else have investigated every single claim of the miraculous through history and know that all of them are false? We can't. No one can. So the only way we can say absolutely categorically that miracles have never happened is if we start with the assumption that they can't happen. But then you end up saying this: miracles can't happen because they haven't happened, and they haven't happened because they can't happen. And that sounds a little bit circular, doesn't it? And actually, it's also not very scientific. Because if I come to an investigation by saying, I've made up my mind what can and cannot happen, whatever the evidence suggests, then actually I might miss something of real value. Imagine if scientists had done that. They would have never discovered quantum mechanics, because they discovered something that they didn't expect to happen, that challenged their presuppositions. But what did they do? They had to alter their presuppositions in line with the evidence. So just because we haven't experienced miracles doesn't mean that they cannot have happened, and there's no way that we can say categorically that they have never happened ourselves. But what about the second question? Do miracles break the laws of nature? And again, it's a big issue today. Someone said to me just this week, they said, look, I can't believe in miracles. I said, why? They said, I study physics. I said, well, what's that got to do with it? And they said, because I believe in the laws of nature. And if miracles started happening, then those laws would have to go out the window, wouldn't they? Well, actually, this is kind of ironic for two reasons. The first reason is, it is the laws of nature that allow us to identify what a miracle is. Because for we said at the beginning, a miracle is not just something that's a bit unusual, like Leicester City winning the Premier League. It is something that cannot be explained simply by natural laws. It's ironic for a second reason, and that is that the idea of the laws of nature actually points back to the idea of a God who created those laws. C.S. Lewis talked about a lawgiver behind the laws of nature. And actually, there are some philosophers of science today who are atheist and don't like the idea of the laws of nature, precisely for that very reason. Nancy Cartwright is one of them. I discovered as I Googled her image that there's two Nancy Cartwrights. One plays the voice of Bart Simpson. It's not her. The other is a philosopher of science. And she said, I think that in the concept of law, there is a little too much of God. In the end, the concept of law does not make sense without the supposition of a lawgiver. And for that very reason, she doesn't like the idea. So it's kind of ironic for a start to say that miracles contradict the laws of nature. But also, do they contradict the laws of nature? Imagine in my drawer at home, I have £100 in £10 notes. I don't, just in case you're interested in breaking in this week. But imagine I have £100 in £10 notes in my drawer at home, and I go away this week to Warwick, and I come back next week, and I look in my drawer, and I find that there's only £50 in my drawer. I don't say, the laws of arithmetic have been broken. I say, no, the laws of England have been broken. Someone's got in my house and stolen my money. Because a law describes what normally happens. The laws of nature describe what normally happens, given no outside interference. The law of gravity tells you that if I drop this book, it will hit the floor. Unless, of course, I catch it on the way down. And the laws of nature tell us what normally happened, but what if the God who created those laws got involved in history at certain points in time? Then it could be quite possible that he could uphold or interfere in what normally happens. And just because he did it at one point doesn't mean that we therefore can't expect the laws of nature to normally happen at other times. So the laws of nature are not contradicted by or broken by miracles. And it is those laws that allow us to identify what a miracle is. Now here's the third question. Is there ever enough evidence to believe in miracles? If I said to you this afternoon, I went to some friends and had Sunday lunch, you would say, I could well believe that. If I said to you this afternoon, I had some friends over to mine for Sunday lunch, you might say, well, I'm not sure I believe that, because can he really cook Sunday lunch? But you probably wouldn't have too much trouble. If I said this afternoon I got abducted by aliens and I had Sunday lunch sitting on their spaceship, you probably would want some kind of evidence before you believed it, right? Because it's a big claim. The bigger the claim, the more the evidence we want. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? And to that extent, we could agree with what David Hume is saying. If someone's going to make a big claim, we want to make sure they back it up. We don't want to naively just believe whatever people say. And actually, the great news of Christianity is that there is extraordinary evidence that we can investigate. And particularly when we put that in contrast to other philosophical or religious claims, we see how strong it stands up. You see, just backpedal for a minute. How would you know, for instance, whether the central claim of Islam is true? The claim that Muhammad goes into a cave and receives the words of Allah as we have it today as the Quran. How would I know whether that is true? Very hard to investigate that very big claim because no one else claims to have been in that cave. The only evidence for it, we could say, is the Quran itself. And you could read it and believe it or not, but there's no way that I could really investigate whether that actually happened as is claimed. Or take Buddhism. How do I know that Buddha really was enlightened and that his teaching comes from a superior or higher source? There's no kind of objective way that I could investigate that claim, great that claim is. But as we've already seen, Christianity is based on the foundation of a grand claim, the claim of Jesus' resurrection. But the difference is that is a public and historic event that you can investigate. You can look at the evidence for it. You can look at the facts that even scholars who are not Christian and don't believe in the resurrection agree on certain things, that Jesus really did die, that the tomb must have been empty, that the disciples really were convinced that Jesus was alive for some reason, that their lives were transformed by this claim, that the Christian church grew based on this claim in the place where all this happens, in spite of all of the opposition of the Jewish and Roman authorities at the time. You've got this evidence, and you have to ask yourself, what am I going to do with it? Now, David Hume would say, when it comes to a miraculous claim, you have to go with the least miraculous option. In other words, the one that is more likely. And so he would say, what is more likely? That Jesus rose from the dead, or that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? And of course, if you put it like that, you can say, well, of course, it's more likely, isn't it, that someone doesn't rise from the dead than does. Okay, statistically, that's pretty obvious. But actually, that's too simplistic. See, what you have to say is, given the evidence for the resurrection, what is the most likely explanation for the evidence? Not simply did Jesus rise from the dead or not, but if he didn't, what's the explanation for the evidence? What's the explanation for the empty tomb, for the appearances of Jesus, for the growth of Christianity in spite of all its opposition? How do we explain that? And once you start to look at that, you realize that the alternative explanations can end up being more miraculous than the original. You have to believe, for instance, that mass hallucinations took place on several occasions, despite the fact there's no precedent in history for that kind of thing. See, it's not simply did Jesus rise or not, but looking at the evidence, what is the best explanation? It's a different way of looking at it. Now again, David Hume might say at this point, yes, but the resurrection is a single event in history. It is, isn't it? Once in all of history. No one claims that this has happened similarly before or since. And he says, because of that, it's so statistically unlikely that we can't believe it. But again, if we applied that kind of thinking to other areas, there'd be other things we wouldn't be able to believe too, like the Big Bang. That's a pretty singular event. And if people said, well, I can't believe it because it's only happened once, we'd have to reject a whole area of science. So we can't reject something just because it's only happened once. So actually, as we start to ask those questions, the impossibility of miracles isn't maybe as strong as we might think. But there's another question, and it's much more personal in one sense, and much more applicable to our lives, and that is, what is the point of the miracles that we read about in the Bible? And what is the point of miracles, full stop? I mean, sometimes when we hear about miracles today, we think, well, yeah, they seem a bit strange, don't they? The kind of miracles that get talked about, gold fillings or fillings turned to gold, and the preacher who turns those fillings to gold miraculously getting provided with a private jet. And you think to yourself, well, why do I need gold fillings and why does he need a private jet? I mean, or people, why is it that God seems to heal people with one leg longer than the other? But as one atheist website says, why doesn't God heal amputees? Yeah, why doesn't God do those kind of things? What is the point of the miraculous? Well, I think in the Bible, when we look at the miracles, particularly the miracles of Jesus, there are three things we see about those miracles. They're not just magic tricks to intrigue us. The first thing we see is that they are signs. We've already said that miracles don't happen all the time. And that is the case in the Bible too. It seems that there are 3 points in the Bible's storyline where God did significant amounts of miraculous things. Bringing the nation of Israel out of Egypt in the thing that we call the Exodus through Moses. At the giving of the law that happened just after that. And the prophets, people like Elijah, later on in the story of the Old Testament. And then particularly Jesus and the beginning of the church described in the book of Acts in the New Testament. And many of the miracles that we see in the Bible are centered on these 3 significant points. And it seems as if God is saying, there are some points when I'm really wanting to get people's attention, get people to sit up and listen to what I'm doing. And of course, if miracles did happen, as we've already said, then would we take particular attention of those points when they did, like the resurrection of Jesus? John, writing his account of the life of Jesus, doesn't actually call Jesus' miracles miracles. He calls them signs. He says they're to point us towards something else. They signify something. They're to get our attention about Jesus and who Jesus is and what Jesus is offering. So that's the first thing, they're signs. But secondly, they're also gifts. Have you ever thought, if you had the power and the ability to do what Jesus had done, what would you do? It'd be kind of fun, wouldn't it? I mean, you would save on ferry crossings to the Isle of Wight because you could just walk. You could save on mass catering for church fellowship teas because we'd just bring one person's packed lunch and we would have it all sorted. Your round at the bar would be much cheaper because you'd only need some glasses of water and that would be all sorted too. I mean, we could do all sorts of things, couldn't we, with miraculous powers? And yet, when you read about Jesus, who seemingly has the greatest power of all, the remarkable thing about his use of those powers is this. He always uses it for the benefit of others, and he never uses it for his own benefit. Never for his own benefit, always to help and to serve other people. And in fact, there are 2 occasions in the story of Jesus' life where he is encouraged to use his powers for his own benefits. At the beginning and the end of his public ministry. At the beginning, he's tempted by the devil to turn stones into bread to feed his hunger. But he says no. And then on the cross, he's mocked and asked the question, why, if you have the power to save others, can't you save yourself? But he doesn't. Never does Jesus use his power to help himself, but always does he use it to help other people. Which leads us to a question, doesn't it? Which is, if Jesus did use his power to help other people, why doesn't he do it today? Why doesn't he always heal today? And the answer, I think, is that Jesus' miracles are also, thirdly, snapshots of the future. What do I mean by that? At the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, he says, the kingdom of God has come near. The inbreaking of God's future kingdom, he says it's coming. And then Jesus, along with teaching about this coming kingdom that he's going to bring about, does things that are marks or signs of what that kingdom is like. He makes the blind see. He makes the lame walk. He makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak. He raises the dead to life. He calms a storm. He can turn water into wine. He feeds thousands in a feast. And they aren't just magic tricks, but they're pictures of what Jesus' kingdom one day will be like. Jesus says, one day I'm going to bring about a kingdom where the sick will all be made well. Well, there'll be no need for hospitals. One day I'm going to be bringing about a kingdom where evil is banished and will no longer have a grip on people's lives. One day I'm going to bring about a kingdom where funerals are cancelled because there's no more death. A kingdom where nature, which is so often a foe to be feared, can be a friend that we can live in harmony with. And we see snapshots of this in the miracles of Jesus. Now, of course, there were many people in Jesus' day that weren't healed. There were many people who died who weren't raised to life. He didn't heal everyone then, just as not everyone today experiences healing. But they are pictures that show that ultimately one day he will. And that is the Christian hope. Yes, Christians do believe that God has been involved in this world and is involved in this world. But their ultimate hope and their ultimate future is a day when those things that we see partially in the life of Jesus will be fully brought about. Joni Eareckson Tada was an athletic teenage girl until she dove into a lake that was too shallow, broke her neck, and has spent her life as a quadriplegic. But she said this about her hope that she has as a Christian. Many people had said to her, "Oh, Joni, if you just had enough faith, you would be healed. You will be able to walk again." But she never has. She's not experienced miraculous healing in this life. But she said, "I can still scarcely believe it. I, with shriveled, bent fingers, atrophied muscles, gnarled knees, and no feeling from the shoulders down, will one day have a new body, light, bright, and clothed in righteousness, powerful and dazzling. Can you imagine the hope this gives someone spinal cord injured like me? Or someone who is cerebral palsied, brain injured, who has multiple sclerosis? Imagine the hope this gives to someone who's manic depressive. No other religion, no other philosophy promises new bodies, hearts, and minds. Only in the gospel of Christ do hurting people find such incredible hope." See, what is Joni saying? She's saying, what does becoming a Christian mean? Does it mean healing now? Most often not. She's not experienced that. But what does it mean? It means healing to come. It means the hope that one day there'll be not just a fluffy cloud like heaven to compensate for the pains of this life, but the hope of everything being restored, a physical hope for this creation, for these bodies. And it's all based on the fact that Jesus has done it once and he can do it again. The one who has conquered death in his resurrection is the one who can offer hope in the face of it in the future too. Now listen, I've probably said enough to intrigue some questions, I'm sure. So we're going to take a short break to allow you to do that. And so why don't you take the time now, there'll be a bit more music playing for the next 5 minutes, to turn to the person next to you and say, what did you think of that? And then secondly, what's your question? And I could think of a lot of questions that I might want to ask myself after that talk, and I'm sure you might too. So think of your questions, discuss that with the people around you, and then text them or write them to the number that's now on the screen. And we'll be back in a few moments' time to deal with some of those. So chat away and text in, and we'll be back soon.
Right. Well, the questions are coming in. We've actually had a really good number coming in, so don't hold back. Keep them coming. If you've got a question you've still got written down, lift it up and somebody will collect it from you. Otherwise, keep texting. So, to put Michael on the spot, question number 1. If a miracle has a scientific explanation, is it a miracle?
Good question. Blah, blah, blah. I guess one of the things we say is that a miracle is something that normally doesn't normally happen. So, like we're saying, childbirth, we might say it's a miracle, but in another sense, there was a normal kind of procedure, a natural process to it. Virgin birth, that was kind of something different to the normal natural process of what took place. So we could say the miracle there was something that doesn't normally naturally happen. I guess we could get into complicated questions about some of the Old Testament events. The miracle could be the timing of an event. And so, for instance, there is in Genesis, when it talks about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and people talk about how that might have happened. Can I go a little bit geeky for a second? In an area where they think Sodom and Gomorrah might have been, they discovered a kind of rock that looked like a kind of glazed pot. And they thought this was glazed pottery, apart from the period from which it came was years and years before glazed pottery was ever invented. They discovered that this was not actually a natural glaze. It was something that happens in places where they have like nuclear explosions or meteorites hits in some parts of Siberia, where intense heat creates this kind of glaze on the surface of rocks. And so one explanation for what happens in Genesis with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah could have been something like a massive meteorite strike in a particular period or place. So you could say, well, does that mean that it wasn't a miracle, it was a naturally occurring event? Well, you could say it was a naturally occurring event, but the miracle was the timing and the location of that naturally occurring thing. So if you want to get complicated, you could say maybe that was a natural event, but happened for a specific reason at that time. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, have I confused things there?
You've confused me, I think.
Sorry. If you want to look into that more, talk to me later. But I think normally we're talking about things that wouldn't normally happen, for which there isn't a naturalistic explanation. No. Certainly when we're talking about the miracles of Jesus, we're not talking about something that, there was a kind of effort by some people to say, well, let's just find a naturalistic explanation for all the miracles of Jesus. When he walked on water, there was actually a sandbar that was just under the Sea of Galilee or something like that. And clearly, you can't really do that categorically across all the miracles, certainly not with the resurrection.
So it's reaffirming the fact that a miracle doesn't have a scientific explanation, that it realistically couldn't happen, and that's what makes it stand out. Okay, so a question in here. We often hear of medical miracles happening in Africa or the Far East, which often reach us third hand. How can we be sure that such claims are true when we don't generally see the sort of thing in the West? There is a book, Heavenly Man, that many here have probably read, that contains a huge number of miracles, which, when you read it, seems remarkable. But perhaps we don't see it in the West so much. What's your response to that?
That's a good question. I think to start with, I would say, just because I am a Christian and I believe in a God who can do miracles, it doesn't mean that I naturally assume that every report of a miracle is true. I'd also want to have a kind of healthy degree of skepticism that weighs things up. And so, yes, the fact that we get lots of stories of miracles doesn't mean I say, well, they must all be true. Because I believe that God can do miracles, I don't automatically assume they must all be false either. I think we want to weigh them up. I think there are many, many miracles in the world that are reported that aren't actually miracles. That doesn't mean that rocks my faith as a Christian. It just means that some people are naive. I think when it comes to my Christian faith is not based on whether or not a miracle happened in Africa last week. My Christian faith is based on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. And that, we're talking about a kind of quantifiable kind of event, very public event that we can look at the evidence for and the implications of, that's have repercussions throughout the world for 2,000 years. So I wouldn't say they definitely don't. I wouldn't say that we should assume that they all do. I think we need to weigh them up on a case-by-case basis. Why they seem to happen in certain parts of the world, not others, I think people would have different explanations for. Yeah. And I think the important thing is that my Christian faith doesn't have to be based on God doing a miracle here and now. You know, I know people who've experienced miracles, and would talk about miracles they've experienced. But actually, for me, that's not necessarily very helpful because it's not, it wasn't a miracle in my life. The great thing about the resurrection of Jesus is it's something that we can all kind of look at. So I want to say, we'll start there. I don't discount the fact they could have happened, and they do sometimes happen, but also we shouldn't just assume that because someone says it is a miracle. It may be, in some cases, that it's due to lack of medical knowledge, and that I think is, you think someone's dead, but actually, they had not the sufficient ability to check they were.
Yeah.
People might say, well, was that the case for the resurrection of Jesus? Of course, the difference there is that Jesus was crucified on the cross. The eyewitness notes that blood and serum came out separately. Well, they didn't call it serum, they called it water, but blood and water flowed out, which we now know is medical proof that death would have occurred. So we're talking about someone who was really dead, not just passed out.
Yeah. So conversely to that, challenge miracles when they're said to happen. I guess also, and one of the other questions we've got is, do we think miracles don't happen because we don't acknowledge them? Things happen, but we think we almost ride over it. One of the questions about a colleague at work that somebody had who went in for a cancer op, and when they performed the operation, the cancer had completely disappeared, and that person was prayed for. Do you think at times we don't acknowledge?
I think that can be the case. Again, it goes back to our presuppositions, doesn't it? So often if we say, I don't believe miracles can happen, I don't think they could ever happen, then there's a tendency when a miracle seems to have happened to whatever the evidence suggests, say, well, it can't be a miracle. So I think, yes, sometimes, given what we said about our kind of assumptions, sometimes we might fail to see God's intervention when it is there. And maybe if we're open to the possibility of God's intervention, we start to see it in places where we may have not seen it before.
Okay. If God intervenes for miracles to happen, why doesn't he intervene to stop war?
Yeah, good question. Look around the world today, there's so much that we could want God to intervene in. I think in a general sense, as we looked at, although God can and sometimes does intervene, the reality is very often he doesn't always. He can heal, and sometimes it seems he does, but for a lot of people, that isn't their experience. I think also with war, there's another factor to take into account, which is also God has chosen to allow people responsibility and to be able to make choices. Now, sometimes that is a good thing, isn't it? Because people use that choice to love, and love without choice wouldn't really be love. But sometimes, tragically, people take that freedom and they use it to hurt rather than help, to start wars rather than to bring peace. And we see that God doesn't say, I'm going to step in and override someone's decision every time that decision is going to cause hurt or pain to others. Now, we might wish that God would do that when it comes to the situations in Syria or Iraq. I guess the question would be, where would God stop in that whole process of intervention if he's going to stop when people cause suffering? Okay, he could stop a Hitler, but what about, when my words or actions are about to cause pain to someone else, as sometimes in life they do? Does he stop my lips the minute I'm about to say that word? It would be a very different world, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So I think God has given people responsibility. The tragedy is we often use it to hurt him. He has also said, though, there's going to be a day of justice. So because we're responsible, we're also accountable. And although in one sense we maybe don't like the idea of God judging the world, I think for many people in many parts of the world, the idea of God bringing about justice is a beautiful thing, isn't it? Because it means that he will bring people to account for what they've done.
Yeah. And following that, we pray for intervention. You mentioned Syria then, and many other issues on a smaller scale we pray for. And the question that we've got here is my prayer for a miracle, if in God's will at least, partly dependent on my level of faith?
Ooh, interesting question. Is my prayer for a miracle partly depends on faith? You hear this quite a lot, and actually I think we need to be really careful here. Really careful, because actually it can be causing a lot of pain. I was a few years ago chatting to a group of people, and one of them said, if you've just got enough faith, you will be healed, and if you're not healed, you haven't got enough faith. A girl came up to me later on, and she said, I'm not sure I'm a Christian. I said, why not? She says, because and she explained about a very serious condition that she was suffering from, and she said, I've prayed many times to be healed, and I haven't. So if I haven't got enough faith to be healed, how do I know I've got enough faith to be a Christian? And so it has real personal implications, that kind of question. Faith in the Bible is trusting in something solid. It's not just a thing itself, it's faith in something, faith in the promises of God. And there's no categoric promise in the Bible that we will be healed now. There's the promise that one day in the future, because of Jesus' resurrection, there will be full and final and perfect healing. But there's no categoric promise now. So actually, I can't be told to have faith in a promise that God hasn't made. Now, some people might say that God has given them special insight that they will be healed of something, and they trust in that special insight they have. And sometimes that happens. But again, we just need to be really careful that we don't mistake God's kind of interventional words with my deep longings, because as emotional beings, we can sometimes get confused between those two things. And I think I'm trusting in the promise of God, but actually I'm just trusting in what I hope would be the case. So I think we have to go back to the Bible. Yes, we can have faith that God will perfectly and ultimately heal in the future. But actually we can't and we don't have any absolute promise that it won't, or it will happen now.
Well, you've got the example of Joni Erickson.
Yeah.
Haven't you?
And people would have said that to Joni. If you read her biography, many people went to her in the early stages and said, the reason why you're still in this bed and still in this wheelchair is you don't have enough faith. Which is really painful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I've got a friend whose son died, and he was told if you had enough faith, you could raise him from the dead. Talk about insensitive and painful things to say to someone. The Bible doesn't give us that kind of promise. No. But it does give us something kind of more wonderful, I would say. If I get healed now, ultimately, if I was suffering of something, I will ultimately die of something else. The beautiful message of the Bible is that there is hope beyond death of full and final healing. Yeah. And
as we talked on one of the previous nights about suffering, and it's what God can use that for. He doesn't wish that on us, but when it happens, can use it for the good of others as well. And for the good of others with miracles, you said that Jesus, every miracle he did was for the good of others. And the question here is, how would the miracle, saying that about only performing miracle for the benefits of others, how would the miracle of Jesus walking on water benefit others?
Okay.
Well identified.
Yeah, no, well done. Someone was kind of searching through. It's kind of one of those categoric statements you make, isn't it? And someone's going to sit there and think, I'm sure there must be one. Well, in one sense, Jesus didn't need to be on that water at all, did he? Because if you look at it in the different accounts, we see that actually Jesus was on the shore. It was disciples that were in the boats. So if Jesus had been in the boat and he got out of the boat and walked across the water to get to the shore, you could say that was for his benefit to get himself out of the tricky situation. But actually, Jesus walked on the water, it says, from the shore where he was safe to the middle, to the boat where the disciples were drowning. So I think actually, even in that situation, he's clearly doing it for their benefit. One, to show who he is. Secondly, because they think they're about to drown. And hey, if they're hardened fishermen, they probably were about to drown. And so I think even in that situation, he didn't need to do it for himself. Yeah.
Great. All miracles, can they be attributed to God? Do miracles happen to unbelievers?
Okay, good question. Great questions tonight. It's a fascinating subject, isn't it? Do all miracles get attributed to God? Can they happen to unbelievers? Take the second one first. Absolutely. And there are plenty of cases in the Bible where we see God intervening in people who didn't even acknowledge him at the time. So absolutely, God doesn't say, I'm only going to get involved in the world if people know me. And sometimes he gets involved with people who don't know him because he wants them to get to know him. And actually that's a wonderful thing that God sometimes does, because the Bible says the heart of God is that he longs for people to come to know him and trust him. And sometimes, if it takes a miracle, then he might do that. Now, of course, some people might say, well, if he did a miracle for me, then I believe, and I'm not going to believe until he does one. And we have to be careful there, because remember, there were plenty of people who saw Jesus' miracles, and they still didn't believe. So we can't just say, well, if only I had a miracle, then I would believe. Jesus says, actually, the issue may be kind of more in the heart. Is it that I don't want to rather than I can't? Are all miracles attributed to God? Again, I think that's an interesting issue. Raises all sorts of questions, because the Bible talks about a spiritual dimension to our world. And that spiritual dimension isn't necessarily good. It talks about the idea of Satan and Satan's angels, Satan's servants. And so just because something is supernatural doesn't necessarily mean its source is God or its source is good. I think the Bible does say that Satan's power is limited, so it's not like the yin and yang, equal and opposite. You've got good and you've got bad, the light force, they balance each other out. So I think, Jesus said, he that is in you, meaning God, is greater than he that's in the world, meaning Satan. So I think God's power is greater, but I think we just need to be careful. Just because something's supernatural doesn't necessarily mean it comes from God.
Yeah, okay, yeah, definitely. You personally, have you experienced a miracle?
Good question. I guess, again, it depends how we define them. I think I would say there have been people close to me, one person I think of particularly, who was dying of a brain tumor, who I think the only explanation for how he survived was a miracle. He had a brain tumor, he almost died. When they did a scan, they couldn't even find any bleeding on his brain. Interestingly, he wasn't a Christian, he didn't become a Christian, even though he acknowledges that it might have been a miracle. So I think I have seen things around me. And I think also, miracles aren't, we talk about miracles in the case of healing a lot of the time, and that is one source of miracle. But I think also God can get involved in other ways in our lives. I would say in some ways the fact that I ended up coming to Bournemouth was an intervention of God that I had nothing to do with. And how, a word that happened to get mentioned at a meeting coincided with all sorts of things that were outside of my control. I look back with hindsight and I can see, well, actually, some people talk about coincidences. I think sometimes if you believe in a God who can get involved in history, maybe there are some God incidences as well, where God involves himself in that kind of way too. And looking back sometimes with the benefit of hindsight, we can see how God maybe intervened in a situation that was outside of our control in a special way.
Again, and acknowledging that, again, we can do things can happen, and we can forget that God can really impact our lives. Somebody else has just sent a text in, again, reaffirming what you've just said there about, I've been healed in a way doctors couldn't explain. So a number of people have experienced that miraculous healing. If Jesus can perform miracles, why doesn't he perform one ultimate miracle that enables the whole world to believe him?
In some ways, Christians would point to the resurrection and say he has. That is, to use C.S. Lewis's language, the grand miracle. It's the vindication of all his other claims. And it is something that we can objectively investigate and look into. So I'd say, absolutely, you can look into it. Now, you can always say, could there be more evidence? And to which the answer is always yes. There could always be more, and God could always do something else if he chose to. But the better question is there enough evidence? That's the better question, isn't there? And don't wait for God to do another miracle before you've checked out the resurrection. I would say start with that. Let's look at what God has already done in history before I start demanding that he does some more things in history. And just like I said, don't assume that just because I see a miracle, that would guarantee belief in the sense of commitment. When the Bible talks about belief, it's not just talking about an intellectual assent to some facts. It's talking about a personal commitment to something or someone. It's about trust. And so, God's aim is not simply that I acknowledge that he might be there. The Bible says that Satan believes in God in that sense. But God's aim is that I trust him personally. And actually the miracles of Jesus are to help me see that he is someone that I can trust. So, again, come back to, is it that I can't, or is it that I won't? Is it that the evidence is lacking? Or is it ultimately that I don't want to believe, and therefore I'll kind of stay, well, if I had this, I would. Because it kind of always puts the decision back a bit further. Start with what we have and see what you make of that. Okay,
conscious of making sure everybody's had the chance to ask questions, is there anybody that's got a question that's come up that you think, it's a burning question I'd like to ask from the floor? Anyone got any question? John, can we ask it without a microphone, or do we need the microphone?
Run down with the microphone quickly.
Jez, thank you. Jez very athletically coming down to the...
We hear of miracles in certain churches in America, quite big churches, and also there was a BBC TV program about an Australian guy.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, these people are quite shifty about evidence. So, they push back and they can't provide any evidence. Do you think we're right whenever we hear of a miracle to challenge those people for evidence of those miracles, like medically, etc.?
Yeah. Some people who claim to perform miracles can be rather shifty about letting us look at the evidence for them. And I think that does seem rather suspect, doesn't it? I've got a friend in Southampton who's a medical doctor who investigated some of the claims of certain miracles that have been done by certain people and discovered actually many of them just weren't. And so we've got to be really careful. That's why I say, even as a Christian, we need to make sure we're not naive and we actually investigate things in that way. So absolutely, I would say, I think it is good to check those things out. And it's also good to remember that my Christian faith isn't based upon whether God did a miracle there in America or in Australia. It's based upon the resurrection. And that is something that we get invited to really investigate. So that would also be something be worth thinking through.
Great, thank you. Is there any others at all? No? I've got another couple to ask Michael. A lot of preaching of the gospel goes on today. All around the world. The question asked is, why aren't there signs and wonders accompanying that preaching in modern day?
Yeah, so if you're confused about what the question means, in the book of Acts in the New Testament, we see that sometimes when the apostles, the early Christian leaders, shared the Christian message verbally, it was accompanied by certain miracles that were taking place, that people were healed, and that got people's attention and so on. And so some people would say, well, that should always take place today. Why doesn't it always take place today when people preach the gospel? I think actually if you read through the book of Acts, you see that sometimes it took place and sometimes it doesn't. So it didn't always take place. When we looked this morning at Holdenhurst Road at the story in Athens, Paul goes to Athens, he preaches about Jesus. There's no record of any miracles being done, just him explaining the Christian message. In other places we do see miracles happening. And I think we'd say, therefore, sometimes God does and sometimes he doesn't. But whether he does or he doesn't, the Bible says actually we've got a message worth sharing and we should share it. Some of you know Michael Green. He's an older evangelist and I'll be working with him this week in Warwick. And I said to Michael once, I said, what do you think about this? Should there be kind of miraculous signs and wonders that accompany people when they share the gospel, the Christian message? And he said, in his kind of typically posh English voice, he said, oh, my dear boy, we can't lay them on, but they do help when they happen. I thought that was a pretty kind of real response, which is, sometimes God does things that get people's attention. And he told me some cases of when that's happened for him. But most of the time it doesn't. But it doesn't mean we just say, well, I'm not going to do anything until it does. This week, wonderfully, in Leeds, we saw lots of people coming to discover Jesus. Not because we had done lots of signs and wonders, but because we were able to talk about, in one sense, the ultimate sign and wonder, which is Jesus. I think sometimes the danger is, by looking at whether or not someone's been healed now, we can miss the focus on what it's meant to be, which is Jesus himself. Yeah.
And that example of that girl that came to you, beginning of the day, completely confused, end of the day, completely changed.
Yeah.
I mean, let's not overlook miracles of change when God saves somebody. So now I asked the final question out of order. So, which I was going to ask about, why doesn't Jesus perform one ultimate miracle? And you started talking about that search and going on to discover and to really look into the claims of the Bible. That leads nicely into Alpha and follow on, doesn't it?
Brilliant.
Perhaps you'd like to.
Yeah, we'd really love you to look into this more. Maybe you're saying, well, look, I'm skeptical and I've got lots of questions about this. Thank you for coming. It's great that you can come. We really want to put these events on so that people who've got all those questions and who are skeptical can really investigate. And we don't assume that just after an hour of coming to hear me, that everything will have miraculously changed in your minds. It might take much longer than that. So we'd really want to help you think this through further. A few ways that you can do that. There's a bookstall out where the coffees and the cakes were when you came in. Go and have a look on the bookstall. A couple of things that would be worth mentioning. Firstly, there's some Gospels there, some accounts of the life of Jesus. Why not read one of the eyewitness accounts for yourself? and read it through, if you've never done that as an adult, just read it through from cover to cover. It'll take you a couple of hours. Look at the original claims again. That would be a great place to start. There's a book that I've written called But Is It True? That looks at this question and a number of others. It has a chapter on the claims for the claim of the resurrection, a chapter on the reliability of the New Testament, and so on. So if you've got other surrounding questions, as C.S. Lewis said, the presupposition issue is the first one. Then you need to start looking at the evidence. So if you want to do that, then have a look at that book, and you could take that away as well. We also run a course called the Alpha Course, a couple of times a week, at different times. It'd be great for you to be able to come along and get plugged in, to ask questions, to investigate further. If you want to know more about that, come and see the guys with the badges. Talk to Gaynor down at the front. She's involved in running that. We'd love you to be able to find out more on that. But also, I just want to throw this out. As Pete mentions, for that girl this week in Leeds, in some ways what the Bible says has happened to her is actually a miracle. You see, for 3 years she has gone to church, and for 3 years she's looked at these things. But suddenly it's come together. It's as if her eyes have been opened. And actually, that can happen. And God wants to do that for us, to allow us to be able to really see, to be able to really understand as we turn to him. And so, why don't you pray a prayer that even a skeptic could pray? You could pray, God, I'm not sure if this is true or you're there, but if you are, then I want to get to know you. Please help me to do that. That's not assuming that you believe anything you don't yet believe, but it shows that you're open to it. You don't have to be convinced it's true, but you need to at least be open to the possibility that it might be. And then that might, of course, open up a world of opportunity. And so why not do that, along with reading the books and reading the gospel and coming to Alpha? Make sure you have that openness that says, hey, if this is true, I'm willing to go where the evidence leads, whatever that might mean.
Great. And if you've got any questions this evening, speak to Michael, speak to any of us with the Big Questions badge, and ask us, did we pray that prayer? We all have a journey, our Christian journey that we've been on, and sometimes it's a very interesting journey. We're continuing on with the Big Questions theme in a month's time. It's going to be a very big topic. Is God anti-gay? That's on Sunday the 19th of March. Very topical, but certainly it will be a question that a lot of people have, and again, there will be a challenge for Michael on that topic.
Not me.
Not
Sam
you,
Albury.
sorry. Sam Albury.
We've got a much better speaker next month.
Absolutely.
So.
My apologies on that. Yeah, Sam Albury coming for the weekend to Lansdowne. So, that's Sunday the 19th of March. Again, thank you so much for coming along tonight. We hope you've found it interesting, challenging, enjoyable. Books outside. We've got more tea and cakes. Plenty more to be eaten, so do stick around, say hi, and introduce yourselves. And it's been great having you here this evening. Thank you, and thank you to Michael for coming back down. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you.